Hello, I'm Hugh Wenman-Smith. My research is mostly on urbanisation, but I think there's an intimate connection between what happens in rural areas, agriculture, and what happens in the urban front. And my question's related to that a bit. In Tanzania, despite rapid urbanisation, there's now 3 times as many people on the land as there were at independence. And I think the numbers must be very similar in all other SSA countries. Ricardo tells us, particularly if there's constant returns to scale, it is not surprising that productivity is struggling if you look at labour. So that's one question. The other one, I wanted to develop a bit more the idea that the growing urban demand for higher value foodstuffs must surely create an enormous potential opportunity, certainly for those who are well connected, and maybe more can be made of that line of thought. Thank you.
Right, thank you. This gentleman here, then we're going to go back there, and then we're going to go...
Yes, Alan Bullion from Agri-Europe. I thought they were all fascinating contributions. There seem to be some gaps, though. I mean, you know, I'm a political scientist by training, and there was no mention of the role of governments. And I wanted to know, I mean, obviously the governments must make a difference in technology adoption, dissemination from one country to another. The other big gap was agribusiness. I mean, the last speaker mentioned that people don't know what they're growing in the field, which I thought was quite interesting. So, you know, what about the seed companies and agribusiness itself in the wider role of this technology rollout? Thank you.
Fine. Gentleman, yep.
My name is Moses, originally from Kenya. My question has got to do with politics as well. I was just wondering what the role of governance is in raising productivity, and whether it will be possible to raise productivity in the current environment of political leaders in Africa.
And last on this round, Benny.
I'm Benny Dembitzer. I'm a Marxist. I don't belong to any organization that would have me, the Groucho Marxist rather than Karl Marxist. I have 3 points. The first one is I don't understand why more research is required when everything is very specific to specific bits of land and earth and water and so on. So why do more research which is not applicable to other places? The second thing is that in the World Bank report, I think, was it 2008, Steve? Is it 2008, the big agriculture report? It said that 3% of the surface of the arable surface of Africa had actually land tenure, and primarily in the cities. My goodness, how can you skip over that? There is a bloke called Joe Stiglitz, he's also an American, I believe, and he got Nobel Prize in economics, and he said something in his Globalization and its Discontent, which I think rings true and has been ignored up to now, and it's this. The elites of the North have never challenged the ownership of land because it would have antagonized the elites of the South. No one here has talked about education of farmers. The World Bank back in the 60s, I remember, did a study. 3 years of primary education to women farmers made them better farmers. And my last point is that in most African villages, no one has ever seen a rich farmer, which is why they don't stay in farming.
Okay. Now, before I turn some of those questions back to the panelists, we've got a few things coming in online. Let's have a look at the online questions. There's one that looks very similar to the question about agribusiness. It comes from Javier, who is a private sector consultant. Are there any lessons from the $200 million African Enterprise Challenge Fund, co-funded by DFID, AGRA, and the African Development Bank? So another question about that. And then from Michelle, Concern Worldwide in Sierra Leone. She says the PRSP in Sierra Leone focuses on smallholder commercialization. Is there an argument at policy level for encouraging larger scale land ownership? And she adds, there seems to be a sense that every smallholder farmer can become a commercial entity, and that's not going to be the case, and in reality is not lifting households out of poverty. So I'd be interested to hear what the panel thinks about that. Now, I'm hoping that you've kept those various questions in mind. You don't have to answer all of the points or questions, but let's have a quick run across, starting with you, Chris, over on the left, and then we'll run through to Doug.
Okay. So this spans a spectrum of things, all of which many of which I can take stands on. Too many people in agriculture, so it's not surprising that productivity is going down. Links tightly with the last question about encouraging large-holder enterprises and development of smallholder farms. And it actually links to the 3% of land being titled, perhaps. The fundamental role of agriculture in African development, I think, is to go away. It's to have people leave the farms and to do something more productive on manufacturing or in services in urban areas. That's what, in the long run, most people want themselves and for their children. And so I think that finding ways to encourage bigger farms using machines in the long run is exactly what we want to do. One of the reasons for the slow rate of migration from rural to urban areas might be the fact that so much land is held in usufructs, where you give up your rights to the land when you leave, and so it's an extra cost to migration that wouldn't be true if you had different types of property rights. That doesn't mean that titling is the right thing to do, because this type of land tenure system has enormous benefits as a social support system and enables people. It's why there's no landless class in most of Africa. And so I'm not saying that one should just go and title all the land, but I think these things are linked together. And in the long run, I'm building on Doug's earlier comment, the most important thing to be done, I think, for the welfare of rural people is dynamic urban growth and jobs that enables it to make it possible for the children of current farmers to become people who have jobs. Okay, so there were lots of other things to talk about. I could talk about agribusiness too, but I'll stop.
Agnes, thanks, Chris.
Well, I don't really have much to add. So why don't you give the word to Ruth and I'll
Okay.
think.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
okay.
Ruth?
Yeah.
Let me pick up on this issue of the land titling. As Chris points out, just because we in the West can only see titles as being a form of secure tenure does not mean that they are always the way to go, nor even that they are necessarily securing tenure for the poor. And we have lots of examples of that, of how titling often creates opportunities for elite capture rather than security for the poor. So there's a lot of issues there. And we've got even examples from Rwanda of how they did a full cadastre a couple of years ago. The cadaster's already out of date. Even though it was done with supposedly best practices. So I think we've got to look at a lot more than just titling when it comes to security of tenure. And also on the land size, again, I think there's a tendency to say, well, we've got large farms in Nebraska and they're so productive, so therefore, bringing in large farming in Africa is the way to go. Some years ago, Klaus Deininger, the study that he did on when the land grabs were coming in, showed that in fact there is not a lot of evidence that increasing farm size itself increases productivity. In fact, quite the reverse when you're talking about large scale farmers coming in who don't, come back to the heterogeneity, understand the heterogeneity of the environment, which the smallholders often do. And in terms of the livelihoods, until you have that wonderful other sector for everybody to go to, doing land consolidation can be really counterproductive. Here, let me give two examples from India, which is where much of my work has been. The contrast with the landless and the fact that in India you still have the largest concentration of poverty on the planet is in India, with, despite all the growth, large groups being left behind because they have started out landless and basically assetless. Even when it comes to the other occupations, Anirudh Krishna has done a lot of study of this that shows that kids who grew up in rural areas have not made it into the good jobs, even in urban areas, because they haven't, the quality of the education in the rural areas is so low. He's done tracer studies. The kids who have made it have at least done high school in the cities, because there was somebody then who gave them aspirations. And until we get libraries in rural areas, where kids can actually read a novel and get a different view of the world, and until we've got education that equips them and gives the aspirations, I don't think, confusing the end with where we are with the solution is probably something we need to worry about.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. Okay.
I'll pick up a couple of things. There are one or two I think that specifically I should deal with. I think the question about the lack of urbanization, in a way, the growing rural population, is Chris has already spoken to. But I think one of the curious features of the patterns of development in Africa has been, until fairly recently, a substantial disarticulation between rural and urban areas and rural and urban economies, which is it's been written about going back to Jane Geyer's work and various other people, so it's not a new thing. We're finding areas, and Agnes mentioned these, where you have some of these more dynamic rural areas connected to cities emerging along transport corridors. But there's also the case that urban demand isn't always driving productivity in the surrounding rural hinterlands. You have cities in West Africa that are drawing to a high degree on imported food, imported rice, imported meat, frozen meat products from. So it's not quite the case that you're seeing the link between the urbanization and the agricultural productivity growth that you might hope for. And I think there's some really interesting questions around why that is the case and about what kinds of policies might be appropriate to respond to that. The question about agribusiness, which I think is a really good one, what's the role of agribusiness? Here I think I would put that define agribusiness rather broadly as everything from local input dealers and implement dealers all the way to the multinationals. I think too often we get really focused on the role of the multinationals, and we forget to talk about this really important, the shopkeepers who are selling fertilizer. There's some really interesting issues here around quality and adulteration issues in seed and in fertilizer, and same issues that Chris talked about earlier with information, that farmers don't necessarily have an easy way to observe what they're buying, just as consumers can't necessarily observe the attributes of the outputs that farmers produce. So lots of interesting questions there. For the agribusiness development on the input and genetics side, there's some complicated issues. Others here would know much better than I. I'm not a biologist, but if you think of some of the crops that are grown, like cassava that's primarily vegetatively propagated, it's not much of an obvious role for agribusiness to get involved in the genetics end of things. Farmers save their seed for many crops, farmers use their planting materials, and so there's not much of an incentive for the agribusiness sector to get involved in research, which is why it's become a public good for much of the region. But I think on the input supply side, we're still dealing with the residual impacts of a lot of years of state control of input supply systems in many countries, and the liberalization of input markets, which is incomplete in a lot of countries, may open up space for input supply. Maybe I should stop there. Governance. I think I'm not going to touch that one really, mostly because I don't know about it. I think Ruth's presentation talked about institutions, and I think probably all of us here would think of the state as one of the entities involved in governance. I don't think any of us take issue with the idea that the state has a crucial role to play, and that the state, for reasons that are, I think, probably too well understood to go into, states in Africa have not been particularly interested in agriculture until comparatively recently. But I think it's a moment, as Steve said in his introduction, when that environment has changed and when agriculture is on the agenda much more clearly for a lot of countries. So, although at the same time, with resource rents spilling in for a lot of countries, the neglect of agriculture becomes pretty easy once again. But I don't know if anybody else wants to touch on governance or anything else.
I would just like to say something about urbanization and then maybe briefly something about governance. And I think that ties into the question about urbanization posing new market or presenting new market opportunities, basically. And I think there's also this need to consider lower level urban centers, because most of Africa's urban population still lives in lower level urban centers and may have less discerning populations in terms of very draconic standards for particular food products, and may be less prone to replacing locally produced food with imported foodstuffs. So I think that's also we shouldn't forget about sort of the hierarchical aspects of urban consumption patterns. And small towns may also, for reasons of infrastructure, provide a more accessible market for rural areas. Yes, governance. I think. There's, and again, none of us are political scientists, so but the whole issue of fertilizer subsidies and sort of technology or subsidized technology is, I think, still. Regardless of what you feel about this particular issue of fertilizers or subsidized fertilizer, it's still a reflection of some sort of government involvement that perhaps wasn't there some 10 years ago, with many governments now having different types of subsidy schemes, which are more or less successful, but that's a different matter. But there seems to be at least a political intention.
Okay. Chris, you said you wanted to come back with...
Yes, as a professor, I have to respond to the idea that why do research if it's not applicable to other places?
Oh, yes.
But it is.
Exactly. The key is to understand where and why. The fact that you could benefit from access to finance, you're constrained, you're credit constrained, and you have opportunities, and you do not, is true. And hence it's a ridiculous policy to go around giving out money to everybody or subsidizing credit to make it possible for everybody to borrow, I think. But trying to understand why you are not constrained or why you are is exactly what we need to do this research to do, is try to understand the forces that shape this heterogeneity. I think it's actually the most exciting development in trying to understand what's going on in rural Africa, is trying to understand why two farmers who look similar to me are really different in their constraints, or why one community is marginal and another community is not. Trying to understand the determinants of that. Some of it's soil, some of its institutions, some of it is the way the state has played its role in that place. And trying to understand that, I think, is what makes these long-term studies, for example, so rich.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's have another round of comments. I'm going to look in this direction because I didn't look in your direction last time. So, gentleman here.
Everyone's waiting.
Those of you on the right, I'm only looking up to the middle of this one on this one. So.
So it seems to me that in your description you may have been separating a little bit too much the role of the agronomist from the one of the economist, in the sense that yes, we need new technologies, but why hasn't there been more technologies in Africa during all this time? And perhaps because the uptake of these marginal improvements have been very slow, then there is little incentives for at least the private ones to develop more technologies and spread these technologies. So perhaps we should think more of these roles being tied together rather than separated ones.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. This gentleman here.
I'm Shinta. I'm from Reading University and a postgraduate student. And I think as long as farmers focuses on productivity, there would be another problem, such as environmental pollution and also like residual in the food. And how do you deal with those kind of problem alongside with increasing productivity?
This lady first, just behind you, then gentleman.
Antoinette Salah. Thank you for your presentation. I agree with many of the points that you've raised, but at the same time also I just want to pick up one point that the discussant raised about the fact that we sometimes think that African farmers have to be super farmers within 50 years. I think that we have to give the African farmer the time to grow up based on all the agricultural technologies, discoveries, all the engineering discoveries, but also give them the opportunity to do what they know best they're doing. And the other point that I wanted to raise is that Ruth mentioned gender, I think, in irrigation. One point that hasn't been specifically mentioned is that is the role of women in agriculture. And there again, there are 2 points that are to be focused on. Is food production for household food security and the national food security. If we are going to talk about self-sufficiency within a household and therefore the end of poverty, we need to focus, research need to focus on women who are producing the food to feed their families. And that is very important. I think the real question should have been who is to focus on agricultural productivity, and it's women. We are not doing much research on women's role in agriculture to produce food for the future generation. Thank you.
Yeah. Gentleman just in front of you, and then we'll take the yes.
I'm Jonathan Sherwood. I'm a private consultant. I've got one very specific question for Agnes, and then a general point which might stimulate some response. On one of your slides you had the potential yield as well as the actual yield. I just wondered how you got that. And the general comment is that when referring to inputs, everyone talks about seeds and fertilizers, but no one ever mentions crop protection products. And the crop protection market is actually bigger than the seed market in Africa. And if you're talking also about facilitating the process of urbanization, the use of herbicides is actually absolutely critical.
Okay, two more gentlemen over there and gentlemen over in the far corner. So don't worry, we'll come back to you in just a moment.
Okay, thank you for your presentations. I'm Nigerian, and I've had the opportunity of working closely with government at some point. So I'd like to ask a question just to elaborate a bit more on the question about governance in Kenya. you'd find that a lot of research has been done for years, and the innovations and all the data that are available are not being used by government. It's how can we link research to governance? In 2012, I had a chance of doing some work for regional governments in Nigeria. And I asked a simple question as to, agric policies that these state governments had. None had. 6 state governments in Nigeria, they had no agricultural policy. So how are they conducting agricultural business, as a government? So, and you can hardly find credible agricultural data in the coffers of government in Nigeria. So there has to be a linkage between what you do and what those organizations funding agriculture does. There has to be some sort of linkage. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And now the gentleman here with his hand up.
Hello, thanks to all the presenters. My name is Ibrahim Yebuza. I'm an agronomist. And from the theme of the meeting is saying raising productivity in African agriculture. So what comes to my mind immediately is that somebody somewhere has already decided that agriculture in Africa, the productivity is low, and maybe is comparing it with other parts of the world. And I came a bit late, but on one of the slides, I saw about 3 crops, maize, sorghum, and rice. You have to understand that although these crops are to some extent like staple in Africa, we have our own indigenous crops that are staples as well. So when productivity issues or issues relating to agriculture in Africa is to be discussed, it's good to, as well as looking at crops that are of global importance, look at crops that are indigenous to Africa that have importance as well. Nigeria, I'm from Nigeria, and as far as I know, FAO website, Nigeria has consistently been the largest producer of yam and cassava. And these are important staple crops in Nigeria. So despite the problems militating against productivity of agriculture in Africa, it doesn't mean that it's all problems. We have good stories to tell. So if people are doing research as well as looking for problems, it is also good to look for where Africa is doing well and make such presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a reflection on those points and questions. Agnes, there's a very specific one for you about where do you get your potential yields from?
The potential yields, they're calculated on the basis at the village level. So they're comparing, it's basically the difference between the average yields for the top 5% compared with the rest. So.
Okay.
Perhaps
maybe I should respond to any of the other.
Maybe I should respond to the last question, which I think related to that.
Yes.
And maybe you didn't. Well, first of all, there's a very basic reason for looking at these particular crops that I presented, and that's they're easy to measure. So it's the cereal crops are easier to measure the yields of in terms of, especially when you're comparing across countries and you're dealing with different types of measurement units and so on. And then I think perhaps you missed the introduction when I explained how the sample was taken, and the basis for the sample was we sampled regions across the maize and cassava belt. So we actually have data on cassava, but we haven't been able to use them because of these measurement problems, which are quite well known and always crop up. But we've also collected data on yams and cocoa yams, and but not on the amounts grown. We can't calculate the yield measurements, but we have data on whether the crop is grown. So we have that sort of data. And we're also trying to look at the positive cases, not just the gaps. Yeah.
Okay, let's come this way this time. Doug, do you want to?
Sure. So I think I'm probably the only one of the four of us up here who hasn't explicitly worked on issues around gender in agriculture. So maybe I'll talk about it. I think it's a little bit of an embarrassment that we didn't give it more attention. It was mentioned in a couple of presentations. And I'm going to pick up just one specific point, which is, I think the issue you raised about the importance of women in agriculture prompts me to, I'm going to take this in a very specific direction and think about the ways in which we're defining productivity, going back to another, trying to connect this to another comment. It may be that we shouldn't just be defining the kinds of research that we're doing or the kinds of productivity increases we're looking at simply in terms of the physical quantities of output that we produce from a piece of land. We may actually care very much, for instance, about doing research that frees up women's time. So you could imagine varieties that require less processing time or less cooking time and therefore require less firewood to be collected. And so I think within the CGIAR, Ruth, who actually works there, can correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a lot of attention being given to the ways in which, if we define the attributes of agricultural technologies a little differently and think about the roles that women play, it might point us towards something other than just varieties that increase the physical quantity of stuff that's produced on a piece of land. And we need to be thinking about productivity within the entire system. It might be that the biggest impact you have is to free up labor, or women's labor, from agriculture or from processing or food preparation time towards other things. So I'll let other people touch on gender issues if they want. Just say this is something that's so much a part of the ways we're thinking about agriculture these days that it's a little embarrassing, but it's so internalized that we perhaps didn't give it the attention we should have. I wanted to touch very briefly on crop protection. I think this was a really interesting, from the time I've spent in the field in recent years, we may not be talking much about it, but farmers are very aware that if you don't put herbicide on some crops, so in places where you see fertilizer use zero, and economists are running around trying to understand why fertilizer use is nil, people are spraying herbicide, and they'll tell you it's because you can't get a crop without it. And I think Chris would know more about this than I do, but I think this is closely related to the shortening of fallow systems in places where previously you could allow succession, kind of ecological succession to control weeds. Now you see fallows shortened because of pressure on the land, and as a result, people are spraying herbicide. So I think we have a decent understanding of what's going on there, but it's absolutely true that that's something that you see more and more of. And I think on the question of indigenous crops, actually really flag, the things like teff and fonio and various others that really haven't gotten research attention at all. So there's a deficit, as Chris mentioned, across the board on research for African agriculture, but very specifically on a number of crops that are locally important, have potential. Since there's been so little research done, you'd think there's a lot of potential to achieve impact. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Ruth.
Can I go next?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of embarrassing. Actually, it was somewhat deliberate. I lead the IFPRI Gender Task Force. And I've gotten a bit of a reputation as always talking about gender, and I thought, oh, Chris Udry's along here on the panel, and it's so much more effective when a man talks about it. So, my apologies on this. And two things I do want to say about that. One of the issues on uptake of technologies, we're doing some work on studying climate smart agriculture. And we've done some research in Kenya, Uganda, and Senegal of looking at men's and women's knowledge of and adoption of a whole range of climate-smart agricultural technologies, which range from improved, stress-tolerant varieties to planting trees to zai pits and a whole range of things. In Kenya, the interesting finding is that women are much less likely to know about most of the technologies. If they know about them, they're no less likely to adopt. This is a big, big issue in that women are not thought of as the farmers in so many contexts. So they're just not, and the extension systems are not reaching out to them. I think, Chris, it's great that you're looking specifically at that. So where they are, but then you have to go even a step upstream of, are the technologies being developed that women want and value? And I don't think we're asking enough about that. The things like, at one point in about 2009, there was a discussion for the CGIAR of what would it look like if the needs of women were given equal priority with the needs of men. And I think the crop mix would probably be a lot different. In particular, picking up on the idea of indigenous varieties, there is a hopeful strand here in that when we start looking beyond productivity to nutritional outcomes, then crop diversification and a lot of these indigenous varieties, indigenous vegetables, things like that, come up much higher. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, having been, I was with Roots, which is this grassroots women's organization in Kenya, going around the farms there, a lot of the weeds that any agronomist or conventionally trained agronomist would identify as weeds, the women are picking that up and saying, this is really good right after childbirth, this helps with this. This one is really good when your child has worms. And just the patterns that were there. And I can tell you, one of the outcomes of the Green Revolution in Asia that we've studied, in Bangladesh in particular, the increases in rice productivity crowded out the wild leafy greens, which had been important in the crop. And that has nutritional consequences. So if we recognize that one of the most powerful interventions for development is improving the nutritional status of the children in their first 1,000 days, which starts at conception, then really paying attention to the nutritional content of the food that not only children get, but that their mothers get, is really fundamental. That is one thing where I think the CGI there is some hopeful work on that.
Thanks, Ruth.
Should I say something about gender? It's mostly based actually on observations from the field, which sort of tie into your points, and they have to do with technology and extension, and it's again very sort of impressionistic issues of holding focus groups in Zambia, where they were introducing conservation agriculture, which is basically based on a combination of no-till agriculture together with herbicide use in various mixtures, local versions of this. But it's a very knowledge-intensive strategy, which has been shown to increase yields quite dramatically. And so I asked in this village, and people were very enthusiastic. Yes, it's improving things and so on. But what then are the drawbacks with respect to women using this technology? And then it turned out that the containers for the herbicides are too heavy for women to carry. So it's very basic things. While the female literacy rates were much lower than the male literacy rates, which meant that the women couldn't read the labels, the hazardous stuff warning labels. So there were those sort of minor issues. But then in relation to extension, I've also held focus groups actually in different contexts where the extension agents say, well, it's mostly the women who attend the meetings. And then when you talk to the men, they say, well, it's because we don't want to experiment with new technologies and lose face if they fail, so we send our wives, or we would like the women to try out this technology before we adopt it ourselves. So but those again are based on male focus group discussions. This was the reasoning offered for this. Yeah.
Wonderful. Chris.
Okay. I'm not going to talk about gender. No, we're doing research on the interactions between how female farmers and extension systems that are dominated by men, how that works. But let me put that aside because I think you guys have really mentioned the key points. I do want to make 3 points. One is just to say something that Doug told me in response to your question about why there hasn't been new technology in Africa. You gave me these stunning numbers that I use in my class every year. They're out of date now, but say a decade ago, the amount of money that was spent annually on research on cassava improvement in Africa by the entire international agricultural research system was way less than half the research budget annually of the Yale Economics Department. And so
Wow.
It's just the order of magnitude. Well, it's off by 3 orders of, it's off by a lot. And so it's not surprising that when that goes on for 100 years, that the stock of available ideas, technologies, this global public good, which has to be provided largely by African governments, actually, is just out of line with research on agriculture in the United States or in Europe. That's one. 2, my most popular way of getting in trouble with my friends in New Haven is when I rave about how excited I am about crop protection products starting to be used in northern Ghana. And it's happening, I think Doug said it right, because reduced fallow periods make it much more important, and wage rates rising as well, make it really important. But that links into another question that somebody raised, which is this focus on productivity has this danger of environmental problems and food safety problems. And the regulatory system, in order to monitor that, even to know if there are issues, is still so weak in many parts of Africa that it's a concern. I don't think it's a first order concern right now because levels are still very low, generally. And so I think the environmental problems are probably locally important, but in the long run we have to figure out how to deal with that. And third, and finally, back on governance and trying to get governments to use data and research to inform agricultural policy, there's such a vital role for credible agricultural data. And that just doesn't exist in many places. And it's not clear that ministries of agriculture can generate credible agricultural data. It's something for government statistical agencies to be doing. So I'm very enthusiastic about the World Bank's expanded living standards measurement survey programs coupled with their integrated surveys on agriculture, which in a number of countries is working with government statistical agencies to generate systems for doing precisely that, for precisely generating credible data about agriculture. There are lots of other sources, lots of international organizations collecting data. We're all collecting data, making them public, but we need these national level systems to provide input into decision making. And that's the kind of public good that is actually our job to be providing.
Fine, thanks, Chris. I'm gonna make an enemy of a colleague here because we're out of time now. We're at 7:14. We're going to finish at 7:15. So you can always ask the question because you're going to be around this evening. So let's end it there. Terrific discussion. Lots and lots of things raised. The biggest single thing on my scratch pad here is this comment about heterogeneity. And I stick right next to the word heterogeneity, hope. As an optimist on these things, when you see heterogeneity, it means we're seeing some good things happening, yeah? And if some good things can happen in some places, then the big question is, why can't we replicate, why can't we reproduce that anywhere else? I mean, it's always something against the pessimist, because the pessimist will always have you believe that nothing is ever going to get better. And one very final point, because I do have an original training as a geographer, location, space is not fixed, it's a social construct, etc., etc. And Tom Jane and his research teams at Michigan State University have been doing some very interesting things on the distribution of African population across space. And the reality is that the median rural African farmer now lives in an area inside of a couple of hours' drive of a major city with a population density of about 160 per square kilometre. Now, an awful lot of Africa is sparsely populated and very remote, but that is no longer the case of the median rural inhabitant of Africa. The well-connected areas, the ones that have the dynamic possibilities, are increasingly the majority area. And again, I take that as a very optimistic point. We've got a big problem on what we do with the very remote marginal areas, but fortunately that is a minority of African circumstances. Right, that's enough. I'd like to thank our panelists, Chris, Agnes, Ruth and Doug, and thank you ever so much for coming along.